The purpose of this next lecture is to discuss how Paris during the 19th century is the epicenter for most of the artistic movements that happen in the 19th century into the early 20th century. Initially, Paris is the center of what you might call modernism as well, and artists like Pablo Picasso and Juan Gris and even Duchamp come from Paris as well. Even though Picasso's Spanish, he worked there. So this painting is really a document that shows a lot of the social, economic, and physical changes that went on in Paris. And so I think it's really a good artifact to discuss, to sort of pull a lot of those ideas together. Initially, from a formal or physical point of view, this painting is really almost not impressionistic in terms of the brushwork. If you look at it, it's very smooth and almost photorealistic. In some ways, it's also very traditional in how it is arranged. For instance, it has several points of perspective. It really, initially really is a two-point perspective painting, but it has a lot more than that, and you can take a look at that if you trace out some of the lines. It also has a lot of atmospheric perspective, or sfumato. In the background, you can see that the colors shift from a darker set of shades with a full range of values from absolute dark to absolute light in the foreground. And then as you move into the background, the colors lighten up and it stays in a sort of 50% range in terms of value structure. And one of the other things that happens is that colors become cooler or bluer because as colors move away from you, they recede. In the foreground, you have more of a range of warmer colors, even though a lot of them happen to be earth toned. Now, in terms of color, it also is very impressionistic. And one of the things about Gustave Caillebotte is that he does use non-local color. So for instance, if a traditional painter, someone, let's say from the Baroque era or the Renaissance era, were to have painted this scene, they probably would have painted almost everything with earth tones. And that means that the umbrellas would not have necessarily been that gray. The sky wouldn't have been that sort of weird yellowish green. And the reflections in the pavers, in those paving stones, wouldn't have been that color as well. So I think that those are some important elements that reflect non-local color. If you look more closely at the individuals' faces in the foreground, one of the things that I think you're going to see also is that there's some non-local colors, some grays and blues in their skin tone as well. And that kind of relates a little bit to the Vermeer painting, The Girl with the Pearl Earring, that we studied much earlier. Now, in terms of iconography or symbolism, I think that this painting is very rich and really shows some ideas that Caillebotte was playing with. And I guess the first thing that we could discuss is the sort of crossover of iconography in terms of a sort of Vermeer-esque point of view. For instance, I was watching a documentary on Caillebotte, and they actually showed that he would use one of those cameras that, you know, you stick your head in under the sort of blanket, and it has a little frosted screen. And it showed some of his preliminary drawings. And what he would do is he would go into a location like this on the street, and he would put a piece of tracing paper over the glass, and he would do a sort of line drawing of what he saw there. So Caillebotte is not painting on location or plein air. He's actually sort of using the camera as a sort of camera obscura to document things. And I think that's one of the reasons why the drawing is so accurate and the perspective is so accurate. The second thing that he does in terms of perspective, which is almost Renaissance-like in a way, is that street lamp that's in the center of the picture aligns with one of the points of perspective and sort of divides the left hand of the picture plane into the background, and then the right hand side of the picture plane on the other side of the perspective point makes it the foreground. And I think it's kind of interesting. He's almost giving you a sort of background, foreground point of view all in one painting and using perspective to divide the picture plane. This relates all the way back to the Renaissance when artists like Leonardo did that in The Last Supper in a way where he uses perspective as a way to focus your attention, not necessarily as a way to divide the picture plane up. He does, if you think about how Leonardo used it, he used it as a horizontal, and he put Judas below the horizon line. Now, the next thing that he's doing, which is kind of interesting, is that from an iconographic or symbolic point of view, I think what he's doing, he's showing you Parisians, and he's showing you Parisians during the 19th century after the reconstruction of downtown Paris as a sort of collaboration between Baron Haussmann, or Haussmann is sometimes how it's pronounced, and Louis Philippe, who is the king or emperor of France. And what happened was they had decided, and I discussed this in my lecture on Daumier, that the streets were very narrow initially in Paris, and it was kind of a medieval city. And there were some allegations that because of these narrow closed conditions that there was a lot of disease going on. And one of the things that happened with these sort of narrow streets and the disease and that kind of thing was that people became very ill from that stuff. But I also suspect that there was an element of political and economic control, because one of the things that happened, if you recall that Daumier print, the Rue Transonaine, is that the streets were so narrow that they would build barricades across them, or sometimes when the police would be coming down the narrow streets, people would pick up these cobblestones that you see in the street here and drop them on the police heads. At one point, this caused a sort of raid on one of the houses and a massacre of some innocent people. So what happened then was Baron Haussmann decides with Louis Philippe to widen all the streets and to tear out all of the old buildings and have a new building style and a new construction style. And we see that here in these Parisian streets. This is the new style of building that was reconstructed all throughout Paris. And you can actually think of it almost as the beginning of the trailer home aesthetic, even though these to us look very antique and classic because they're more than 100 years old. The bottom level of these houses had shops in them, and then as you moved up, the wealthier people lived in the lower floors, and as you moved up, the poorer people actually lived upstairs because there were no elevators. So these sort of apartment houses, or brownstones in a way, were a way of reorganizing the economics of Paris and reorganizing the streets and making them broad thoroughfares where people could walk around and see the shops, and it brought a lot of economic prosperity to Paris. There's a lot of sidewalk cafes and a lot of shops in the lower levels of these buildings. So the downtown district is both an area where there's a lot of economic trade going on, and also where a lot of people live. And so you have the consumer and the goods being presented in the same area. The way that these buildings were constructed is they're almost a standard kind of construction, where the bricks and the cast iron fixtures and things like that could be made off-site, and the buildings are fairly uniform in their style. They still have some ornamentation that we wouldn't ordinarily associate with that kind of stuff. So if you look at the people who are standing on the streets, who are walking on these broad streets, they're dressed very well. They're wearing top hats, and the looks on their face are very detached and sort of urbane and very urban in a way. So I think that really is represented in a sort of view of how the Parisians saw themselves as people who were put on a sort of game face when they went out into the streets and wore certain kinds of clothing that would present themselves in a proper, appropriate way. Whereas before this time, even though we might associate things with being a little bit more formal, I think that the middle classes start to become very well dressed, very formal, and become a really important consumer to the goods that are being brought into Paris. And a lot of this is caused by industrialization and the Enlightenment that came in the century before. Now, the last thing is contextual. The contextual stuff I sort of approached in terms of the symbols, and what I'm talking about is the history and background of the reconstruction. So for instance, the street lamp that's behind those two central figures is actually a gas street lamp, because gas lit up the streets and made it possible for people to actually travel around Paris at night, and not really, it cut back on crime and made it a little bit more navigable in the streets. So I think that's also an important element. So let's take a look at the reconstruction of Paris from a sort of more historical point of view and from an architectural point of view, now that we've looked at this painting. These two images show you the deconstruction or demolition of the streets in the broad downtown area where the Opera House was built. And on the right-hand side, I have the replan and how Paris looks from the air pretty much today. And what I'm showing you is that it's almost like the plan of Versailles, where you have these broad sorts of avenues and then these sort of starburst and diagonal patterns that move across the city itself. And part of the reason for this was to make sort of broad thoroughfares where you could almost have parades going down. And notice how that main street terminates at the Paris Opera House. And so you would have a broad street where people could come and go, and it had several lanes to it where people could come and go and get to the opera, which was the center of culture, besides for instance, the salon, for Parisian culture. And the opera house, because industrialization and the work week is shortened and that there's a rise of middle-class people would go see shows at the opera all the time, and they would also want the opera house to be sort of a temple to the arts. So we'll return to that in a little bit in this lecture. The other thing that we see is these sort of diagonals that are running through the cities. And you can see some of the buildings actually they're built around courtyards and air shafts. And these diagonals are designed to allow people to get across the city really fast. And one of my teachers suggested it was also to make sure that the police could get across the city really quickly as well. The apartment houses in Paris are really they're almost a modular kind of construction, and you can see that a lot of the things like the wrought iron and the cast iron railings and banisters would have been things that could have been made off-site and brought in and kept at standard sizes and standard heights and installed. The plan of the buildings, if you look at the buildings, they're also sort of built around air shafts. And the reason why this is that every apartment in that building would have every room would have a window, and it would also allow for cross ventilation. So that's another way of creating a sort of more pleasant experience in terms of apartment living, because if you have interior rooms that have no windows in them, it would become very stuffy and it would become very close. And one of the things still about Paris at that point in time was there was mostly coal being used to heat things, and so it was very dusty and sort of dirty. You'd want to have some airflow moving through. The downstairs floor, the street level, was devoted to shops, so you could basically live upstairs and then run downstairs to a baker or run downstairs to the pharmacy and get the kinds of things that you need in a restaurant. There's also a sort of organization in terms of how people lived in these houses, and the lower floors, because they were closer to ground level, and obviously these were walk-ups and it would take a lot of energy to get to the top of the building, that the ground floors were devoted to wealthier people, and they might even own an entire floor or rent an entire floor of a downstairs apartment. And then as you move further and further up, you get to what we refer to as the garret apartments, the artists' places, and it would be the cheapest place where people would live if they couldn't afford to live on the bottom level. And so it kind of, in a way, these buildings are a sort of reverse hierarchy where the wealthier people live on the bottom, and then as they move up, the poorer people live. Now, the idea of leisure time and activities that the wealthier people could have is sort of culminated in the Paris Opera House. And the Paris Opera House is this beautiful building that has a sort of Pantheon-like dome on it, but it also is a sort of Pantheon, like Saint-Geneviève, and also the original Pantheon in Rome, but brought up to a sort of slightly different level, a kind of level that is, I would imagine, is just a slightly fancier kind of level that's brought through the school of fancy arts, the École des Beaux-Arts. So here's a photo of it right after its reconstruction in 1860. And The main architect for it was a guy named Charles Garnier, and I suppose you could remember that because there's a hair product today called Garnier, and that might help you a little bit. And if you look at it, it has a sort of courtyard effect of all the buildings in the front of it. And so the idea was that you could pull up in a horse-drawn carriage and sort of be dropped off in front of the Opera House, and people could see you. And in a way, this was a promenade and a way to be seen. And so there's a social component to going to the opera that's beyond being entertained. It's actually going there to be seen and to see other people and see how they're dressed. So the Opera House is this sort of jewel box that you as the jewel goes into. And if we look at a better photograph, we can actually see some of the ornamentation on the Opera House, and you'll see a lot of historical precedents sort of played out in the architecture and the ornamentation of the Opera House. This is how it looks today, and with the traffic, sort of circumambulating around the front of it, but I think it's a better shot of it. And what I want to show you is that the dome on it is this sort of squashed hemisphere that's not completely a half circle. You have these sort of Nike figures on the corners of the building. So it's sort of like a temple to the arts, and it has all of this extra ornamentation. And then you have a very mannerist kind of ornamentation on the exterior, where you have things that we saw in St. Peter's, the doubled up columns, the front of the building undulates in and out. The pediments are these sort of rounded half pediments that are below actually the initial sort of cornice of the building and the roof line of the building. And within the windows, there's even smaller columns that are put there. And then on the bottom level, we have a series of arches, an arcade of sort of portals that lead you in and out of the Opera House. In a way, it's a sort of combination of all of these art historical things, all the way back to the Colosseum and the Pantheon, and then through Palladio, and through the Baroque era with Carlo Maderno's facade of St. Peter's. And this is simply called an academic style building because the architect was an École des Beaux-Arts academic architect. Now, let's go inside the building and we can see some other things. The interior of the building has a set of steps that's almost like the library at San Lorenzo that is from the 1500s by Michelangelo. This sort of lava flow of steps that's flowing out. And we can see that it has some things in common with Palladio's Olympic Theater, where we have all of this extra ornamentation throughout the building that's meant to be a sort of stage set, including these sculptures that are on either sides of the banisters, and those sculptures that are holding up these, I think originally they would have been gas lamps because electricity is a little bit later. And these sort of sculptures are reminiscent in some ways of Bernini's sets that he designed, for instance, in the Cornaro Chapel, the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, has a sort of similar feeling to it, where it's almost a diorama with these sculptures on either sides of the steps that are greeting the people who are walking up. The steps and the veneer itself is made out of a multiple materials. So we have bronze, we've got different kinds of granite, different kinds of marble, and in some ways that's a very Baroque kind of thing that also relates back to how Bernini would have handled things. And then the division of the steps into, you walk up that central steps, and there's steps on the left and the right where the sort of crowds would sort of separate and walk up. And you can see that there's a series of balconies. And it always sort of reminds me of the balcony scene or the step scene in Gone with the Wind, where the heroine is like walking down the steps and everybody is looking up at her. And I think that's the main purpose of how the interior would have been used. It's sort of a series of balconies that in which people could look at other people as they were dressed in their best clothing as they were sort of walking up the steps. And in a way, it's meant to be a sort of jewel box that presents the people inside as the jewels and allows them to see and be seen. And I think that in Impressionist painting, we're going to see an awful lot of voyeuristic behaviors being documented in some of the paintings that we will be studying in terms of Impressionism.